French capital is reeling after the most violent riots there in a decade. Central Paris was brought to a standstill on Saturday by the so-called Yellow Vest movement, a wave of protests against fuel prices and declining living standards. Burnt-out cars, smashed glass and a vandalized Arc de Triomphe greeted French President Emmanuel Macron as he toured the aftermath of the rampage. But he wasn't made to feel entirely welcome. And live now to Charlotte Dubinsky in central Paris for us here on the programme. Good morning to you, Charlotte. Just after 7 a.m. where you are now, I understand much of the vandalism and the damage has been swiftly cleaned up. In the meantime, though, the French government, how is it trying to deal with this crisis?
Well, that's right. As you can see, the Arc de Triomphe behind me is now without that graffiti that was daubed on it at those protests on Saturday. And President Macron returned home to France on Sunday to see, as you said, the aftermath of that destruction and that chaos of those riots on Saturday that took place all around this area of Paris, and also were seen on the fringes of other cities where Yellow Vest protests were taking place across France on Saturday. Now, President Macron has ordered the Prime Minister to hold talks with other political leaders and with the Yellow Vest movement, although that so far proved difficult given that the Yellow Vest movement has no leaders. It did elect some spokespeople last year, but 6 out of 8 of those elected last week refused to meet the Prime Minister for a first set of discussions after they received threats from other members of the movement. Now, there has been mooted a discussion by the presidential spokesperson that France could potentially declare a new state of emergency in the wake of these riots as a way of manage them in the future. Although I understand that the presidential meeting that was held at the Élysée Palace yesterday, that wasn't actually discussed, but it is something that's being pondered on and thought over. As I mentioned there, Macron held that emergency meeting at the Élysée Palace yesterday, and we understand that he has asked the Interior Ministry to get ready security forces to make sure that they're prepared and ready in case there are more riots. We've seen here in France now 3 weeks of riots and protests with these Yellow Vest movements. Some people say it's been hijacked from the extreme left, from the extreme right, but the reality is that when you look at the footage, it seems the majority of the people who were at least out here in Paris on Saturday were hell-bent on taking part in that violence. And some have described this as not just the worst riot in a decade, but the worst riot that France has seen since May 1968.
We came back to the Place Charles de Gaulle, and at that moment I was shot. I immediately thought the bullet had come from law enforcement, as the police were shooting from that side at the protesters. They were able to understand I wasn't a protester. I wasn't wearing a yellow vest. I was wearing a leather jacket and a helmet.
Well, this protest, the Yellow Vest movement, or the Les Gilets jaunes as they're known here in France, started about 3 weeks ago. And initially it was because people were angry about the cost of fuel and the taxes that have been imposed on fuel, particularly in the last year, where they've seen an increase of more than 20% for some fuels at the petrol pump. But it's become much more than that. It's become a social movement where people have been telling me over the last few weeks that they're unhappy with with everything in France. They're unhappy with the high cost of living here, with the high rate of unemployment, with poor services in rural areas. And they're also unhappy with the whole political sphere in France, saying that this isn't just about Macron, this is much wider, and that there is a bigger problem here in France. They basically don't believe in a political system. At least that's what the people I've spoken to have told to me. And they have vowed to continue. The government is obviously trying to prepare for that, but there is no knowing yet whether this protest will continue to be as violent and whether it will continue until the end of the year, like some of the protesters have vowed.